"I believe you're in my seat," Serafina Vance stated, her voice a calm, clear note in the hushed cabin of first class. She held up her boarding pass, the crisp paper a stark white against her brown skin. The man, a portly white executive whose suit seemed a size too small and a decade out of style, didn't bother to look up from the blinding glare of his phone. "Beat it, kid," he grunted, a dismissive flick of his wrist accompanying the insult. "You're lost. Coach is in the back, where the rest of the herd is." A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the cabin. The air crackled, suddenly thick with unspoken prejudice. Serafina's eyes, the color of rich, dark coffee, narrowed almost imperceptibly. What was about to unfold on this grounded Airbus A380 would do more than just delay a transatlantic flight. It would detonate a career, expose the festering rot of bigotry at 30,000 feet, and serve as a brutal lesson. The little girl you dismiss might just own the damn plane. This 13-year-old was about to educate a plane load of people on the true meaning of power, and it had nothing to do with age, gender, or the color of your skin. Welcome to the Black Stories, where we don't just tell stories, we forge them in the fires of justice. Every narrative you find here is a testament to strength in the face of ugliness, a chronicle of resilience against the odds. If you believe that prejudice must be confronted and that the triumphant human spirit deserves to be celebrated, then do me a favor right now. Obliterate that like button and subscribe to the channel. We need you in this fight. And before we dive in, drop a comment below and let us know what city you're watching from and what time it is. We want to know who is standing with us. 13-year-old Serafina Vance moved down the jet bridge for Flight 411 to London with a preternatural poise that belied her years. Standing a modest 5'2", with a cascade of intricate braids framing a face of thoughtful intelligence, she navigated the world with the quiet assurance of someone who had sat at boardroom tables since she could read. Her attire, a simple cashmere tracksuit in a muted burgundy, was deceptively plain, whispering wealth rather than shouting it. Most onlookers would miss the bespoke tailoring or the subtle gleam of the platinum watch on her wrist, a gift from a tech titan who had once sought her father's counsel. This was her 20th time in first class this year alone. It was a monotonous commute between her advanced studies program in Geneva, her father's corporate headquarters in New York, and their sprawling family estates in Malibu and the English countryside. For Serafina, the luxury of lie-flat seats and gourmet meals wasn't a treat. It was simply the mundane reality of a Wednesday. Her father, Alistair Vance, was a titan of industry, a self-made magnate who had constructed a global logistics empire worth an estimated $20 billion, making him one of the wealthiest black men on the planet. But to the undiscerning eye, Serafina was just a black kid, a child. And tragically, that was precisely all the man in seat 3A saw. She arrived at her row and saw the problem immediately. A man, likely in his late 50s, had colonized her window seat. He was a caricature of entitled mediocrity. His expensive but ill-fitting suit was rumpled, his thinning gray hair was slicked back with a bit too much product, and his florid face was buried in his phone, his thumbs stabbing at the screen with frantic importance. He had the air of a man who believed his volume equated to his value. He had spread his belongings, a battered briefcase and a copy of a financial newspaper, across both his assigned seat and hers, a clear territorial claim. He was so engrossed in his digital world that he failed to notice her standing there. "Excuse me, sir," Serafina repeated, her voice perfectly modulated, carrying the crisp transatlantic accent of a lifetime spent in international schools. "I think you might be in my seat." She extended the boarding pass again. The letters were stark and unambiguous. Seat 3A, first class. Vance, S. The ticket was flawless, a testament to a transaction worth more than many people's monthly rent. A normal, decent person would have glanced at it, offered a brief, embarrassed apology, and moved. But this man was neither normal nor decent. He finally looked up, his face a mask of profound irritation, as if her very existence was an intolerable interruption. His watery blue eyes did a quick, dismissive scan. Young girl, black, alone. His mind, a rusty calculator of prejudice, clicked and whirred, spitting out a conclusion rooted in bigotry. He didn't even deign to look at her proof. "No," he said, the word dripping with a syrupy, condescending paternalism. "You must be turned around, sweetheart. This is my seat. Economy is back there." He gestured vaguely toward the rear of the aircraft with a thick, sausage-like finger, the casual arrogance of his motion suggesting a man who had never once had his assumptions challenged. The insult hung in the recycled air, a toxic, invisible cloud. A few rows away, a woman in a Chanel suit lowered her magazine, her brow furrowed in disapproval. In the row behind them, a young man with a tech startup logo on his hoodie discreetly angled his phone, sensing a moment of viral-worthy conflict was brewing. Serafina felt the familiar, dull ache of being prejudged, but years of navigating predominantly white, wealthy spaces had forged in her an armor of unshakable composure. Her father had taught her that reacting with anger was to cede control to the aggressor. "Sir," she said, her voice remaining as smooth and cool as polished marble, "I can assure you I am not confused. My boarding pass is for seat 3A. You are in my seat." She moved the pass closer to his face, a silent, final offer for him to correct his mistake without further humiliation. He didn't just ignore it, he chuckled. It was a wet, gurgling sound, as if the very notion of her belonging in this cabin was the most absurd joke he had ever heard. "Listen, darling," he said, his voice laced with mock patience. "I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, but this is the front of the plane. Your mommy and daddy are probably having a heart attack looking for you back in steerage. Why don't you scurry along before you get yourself into a real pickle?" The condescension was a physical force, pressing in on her. He had dismissed her ticket, assumed her parents were of a lower economic class, and infantilized her, all in one breath. Every single one of his assumptions was a universe away from the truth, but his worldview was a cramped, airless box, and he was suffocating in it. The other passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. The woman in the Chanel suit looked utterly disgusted. A young couple in the front row had paused their hushed conversation, their eyes wide. An older gentleman across the aisle shook his head slowly, a sad, knowing look on his face. Serafina remained rooted in the aisle, her boarding pass still held out like a royal decree, her posture immaculate. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The most powerful person in the room is the one who doesn't need to raise their voice. True strength was born of quiet certainty, of an unassailable knowledge of one's own worth, a worth that existed independently of anyone else's validation. "Sir, for the final time, I am asking you to look at my boarding pass and vacate my seat," she said. A new element had entered her voice, a thin, sharp edge of steel. The politeness was no longer a default setting. It was a conscious and rapidly expiring choice. This time, the man, whose name she would later learn was Arthur Harding, looked up with genuine, undisguised fury. This black child was not behaving as he expected. She was not cowering. She was not scurrying away. She was standing her ground. And in his tiny, prejudiced world, this was an act of profound insubordination. His face contorted into a sneer of pure racial animosity. "Look, you little brat," he boomed, his voice loud enough to command the attention of the entire cabin. "I don't know what kind of affirmative action scam you're trying to pull, but I've been flying this airline for 30 years. This is my seat. I paid good money for this seat, and I'll be damned if I'm going to move for some lost child who snuck past the gate agent." The racist dog whistle had become a blaring foghorn. Affirmative action scam. The accusation slapped the air, raw and ugly. Several passengers gasped. The woman in the Chanel suit whispered, "Oh, for God's sake," under her breath. The young man's phone was now recording openly, his face a mask of grim determination. He knew he was witnessing a textbook case of bigotry, and he was going to make sure it was seen. But what Arthur Harding, in his cocoon of ignorant privilege, could never have conceived was that he had just made a catastrophic, career-ending, life-altering mistake. He had chosen to target the only daughter of Alistair Vance. He was attempting to humiliate a girl who had more power in her pinky finger than he had accumulated in his entire mediocre existence. Seraphina Vance was not just any 13-year-old. She was the heiress apparent to a logistical dynasty. She was the child of a man who owned shipping fleets, private air charters, and data centers on every continent. She was a person who had advised her own father on philanthropic investments, who spoke fluent French and Mandarin, and who had been named by a global finance magazine as one of the top 20 teens to watch. And she was about to deliver a masterclass to Mr. Harding on the profound danger of judging a book by its cover. Just then, a flight attendant finally bustled over, drawn by the palpable tension. But instead of being a neutral arbiter of the rules, she took one look at the situation, the enraged, well-dressed white man and the quiet, young black girl, and her own ingrained biases clicked into place. "Is everything all right over here?" she asked, but her gaze was fixed on Seraphina, her tone already accusatory. It suggested she had already identified the source of the problem. If you are finding yourself enraged by this injustice, and you want to see this girl claim her power, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss a second of what's coming. Have you ever been in a situation where you saw someone being treated unfairly because of how they looked? What did you do? Tell me your story in the comments. The arrival of the flight attendant, a woman named Brenda with tired eyes and a name tag pinned slightly askew, should have been the moment the situation was de-escalated. A simple, impartial verification of boarding passes was all that was required, but Brenda had been flying for 25 years, and those years had carved deep channels of prejudice into her professional judgment. She was an expert at making snap assessments, and her assessments were often flawed. When she looked at the red-faced businessman, she saw a platinum medallion member, a man of substance. When she looked at Seraphina, she saw a complication, a child out of place. "Sweetheart," Brenda said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness reserved for unruly children. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." While the request was standard procedure, her tone and the fact that she had addressed only Seraphina, completely ignoring the belligerent man who had yet to produce any documentation, spoke volumes about her assumptions. Seraphina handed over the pass. She watched Brenda scrutinize it, her eyes darting over the paper as if searching for a flaw, a forgery, some evidence that would confirm her initial bias. The pass was, of course, impeccable, but instead of immediately turning to Harding and demanding he move, Brenda faltered. The thought of confronting the aggressive white man in favor of the black child was clearly a deeply uncomfortable one for her. "Well, this does say 3A, Brenda conceded, with a tight, reluctant smile. "But it seems we have a bit of a mix-up." She then turned to Harding, her entire demeanor shifting to one of deference and apology. "Sir, I am so sorry to disturb you. Would you mind if I just had a quick look at your boarding pass?" Harding scoffed, waving his phone at her dismissively. "I don't have time for this. I'm a platinum member. I booked this seat months ago. The system must be wrong. She's the one who's in the wrong place." His blatant refusal to provide his own ticket, should have been the end of the discussion. It was a clear violation of airline policy. But Brenda was more intimidated by his bluster than she was committed to her duties. She was looking for the path of least resistance, and in her mind, that path involved placating the angry man. "Well," she said, her voice weak and wavering, "I'm sure we can figure something out. Perhaps we can find Miss Vance another lovely seat in first class. I can see if the middle seat in row 5 is available." The suggestion was so profoundly insulting that it momentarily took Serafina's breath away. She had a confirmed reservation for a window seat, a seat she had every right to, and she was being asked to move to a less desirable middle seat to accommodate a man who was, for all intents and purposes, a squatter with a racist attitude. It was the physical embodiment of the institutional bias her father had battled his entire life. Before Serafina could voice her objection, Harding twisted the knife, his words dripping with venom. "You should take it," he sneered at her, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "Maybe you can find a seat back in economy. I hear they have plenty of room near the toilets. That seems more your speed." The cabin exploded in a flurry of hushed, horrified reactions. The woman in the Chanel suit audibly gasped. "That is unbelievable." Aish, the young man recording the incident, made a small, satisfied noise, knowing he had just captured the undeniable money shot of pure, unadulterated racism. The reference to the back of the plane and the lavatories was a vicious, historically loaded insult, echoing the segregationist policies of the past. A few passengers, disturbingly, let out nervous titters, their discomfort, or perhaps agreement, adding a sickening layer to the hostile atmosphere coalescing around a 13-year-old girl. A fire ignited in Serafina's chest, a hot, righteous fury, but she quickly doused it with the ice of her father's training. Alistair Vance had taught her that anger was a fuel, but it had to be refined. Uncontrolled, it led to explosions. Controlled, it could power an engine of devastatingly effective action. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying with lethal clarity, "I paid for this seat with my own debit card, linked to my own bank account. I belong in this seat. You, on the other hand, have yet to prove you belong on this aircraft at all." Her words were like surgical darts, precise and deeply penetrating. Several passengers straightened in their seats, a new understanding dawning in their eyes. This was no ordinary child. This was someone who spoke with the quiet, chilling authority of inherited power. But Harding was too far gone, drowning in the cesspool of his own bigotry. He didn't see the warning signs. He only saw a target for more abuse. "You couldn't afford the taxes on this ticket," he spat, his voice rising again. "What did you do? Lift it from someone's bag? Or is this some kind of make-a-wish trip for underprivileged kids?" The implication was clear and hideous. A black girl couldn't possibly have earned her place here. Her presence had to be the result of theft or charity. He was digging his own grave with a shovel of racial slurs, completely oblivious to how deep it was getting. The passengers were now fully engaged, their allegiances clear. The Chanel-suited woman was incandescent with rage. An elderly black man in row 4 was shaking his head with a look of profound, weary resignation. He'd seen this movie before. Faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation, Brenda, the flight attendant, made a catastrophic decision. Instead of calling for a supervisor or airport security, she turned her full frustration on the victim. She chose to align herself with the aggressor. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice sharp and laced with undisguised annoyance, "I need you to stop making a scene. Either accept the other seat or I will have to ask you to deplane for causing a disturbance." The sheer injustice of the threat was staggering. The black child who had been racially profiled, verbally abused, and denied her rightful seat was now being accused of causing a disturbance and threatened with removal. Meanwhile, the white man who had instigated the entire ugly affair sat comfortably, his prejudice validated by a uniformed authority figure. This was too much for the other passengers to ignore. The woman in the Chanel suit shot to her feet. "Are you out of your mind?" she exclaimed, her voice ringing through the cabin. "He's the one causing the disturbance. He's the one spewing racist filth. Do your job." But Brenda had dug in her heels. In her mind, she was maintaining order, and order meant siding with the powerful-looking white man against the young black girl. She was a cog in the machine of systemic racism, and the machine was grinding forward. Serafina looked around the cabin, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the witnesses. She saw disgust, she saw apathy, she saw confusion, and she saw a few faint glimmers of support. But all of them, every single person on that plane, were about to receive an education on the perils of assumption. "Ma'am," Serafina said, addressing Brenda with a lethal calm that sent a chill down the spines of those closest to her. "I strongly advise you to reconsider your next words. You should be very, very careful about how you proceed from this moment." There was a weight to her words, a quiet promise of consequences so vast they were unimaginable to the two people who were tormenting her. But they were too wrapped up in their own petty prejudices to hear the alarm bells. They had no earthly idea that they were poking a sleeping dragon, and that its father was about to breathe fire that would incinerate their careers and expose their rotten souls to the entire world. Make sure you are subscribed with notifications on, because the moment this girl reveals who she is will be one you'll want to watch over and over. This racist passenger's entire universe is about to implode. What do you think is a just punishment for employees who enable and protect racist customers? I want to hear your unfiltered thoughts in the comments. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had become a powder keg. What began as a simple request had spiraled into a raw, public spectacle of prejudice, forcing everyone present into the uncomfortable roles of witness, accomplice, or ally. The air was thick with the unsaid, vibrating with the energy of a conflict about to breach its containment. Arthur Harding, feeling vindicated by the flight attendant's support, decided to press his advantage. He had misread Serafina's composure as weakness, her politeness as fear. His bigotry had constructed a narrative in his head where he was the righteous authority figure putting an uppity child in her place. He stood up, using his physical size to loom over her, a classic tactic of intimidation. "You see? This is what happens when you don't know your place," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Your problem is that you people have been given a free pass for too long. You think you're entitled to things you haven't worked for. Well, let me tell you something, little girl. This is the real world, and in the real world, actions have consequences." The thinly veiled racism was now gone, replaced by an explicit, ugly screed. "You people, know your place." These were not just insults. They were the verbal relics of a hateful ideology. The phones recording him were now numerous. The middle-aged black woman in row 4, who had been simmering with rage, finally erupted. "Hold on a damn minute," she said, her voice powerful and resonant. "What did you just say to that child? Did you really just tell a black girl in the 21st century to know her place?" Harding wheeled on her, his face flushed a deeper shade of crimson. "Mind your own business, ma'am. I am simply trying to restore a little bit of decorum by explaining to this child that her circumstances don't permit her to be in this section." The word circumstances was wielded like a weapon, heavy with the racist implication that her blackness was a disqualifying condition for being in first class. It was the logic of apartheid, dressed up in the language of a disgruntled airline passenger. Serafina had had enough. She had absorbed the insults, endured the condescension, and weathered the threats with a poise that would have been admirable in an adult, let alone a 13-year-old. But now it was time for the lesson to begin. Her father had not raised her to be a victim. He had raised her to be a warrior, armed not with fists, but with influence, intellect, and the devastating power of their name. "Sir," she said, her voice slicing through the tension like a shard of ice, "I suggest you sit down and remain silent. Your opportunity to resolve this peacefully has expired." There was a finality in her tone that gave even Harding a moment's pause. This was not the plea of a child. This was the pronouncement of a judge. He let out a harsh, barking laugh, trying to reclaim his dominance. "Or what? What are you going to do? Are you going to cry to your mommy? This isn't the playground, sweetheart. This is where the adults play." "You are correct," Serafina replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "This is where adults play, and you've just been checkmated." She reached into her small, elegant designer handbag, a bag that ironically cost more than Harding's entire suit, and retrieved her phone. It was not a standard-issue device. It was a custom, encrypted satellite phone, a piece of technology available to only an elite few, with direct lines to the nerve centers of global power. "I believe it's time I called my father," she said simply. Harding roared with laughter. "Oh, this is rich. Go on then. Call your daddy. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear how his little girl is holding up the entire plane." A few passengers exchanged uneasy looks. There was a dangerous confidence radiating from the girl, a calm certainty that suggested her father was not a man to be trifled with. Harding, however, was too arrogant to see the abyss opening up at his feet. Serafina pressed a single button, a speed dial programmed for one number. The phone connected almost instantly. She looked around the cabin, her eyes meeting those of the other passengers, a silent promise in her gaze that justice was imminent. "Hello, Daddy," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I apologize for interrupting your meeting in London, but a situation has arisen that requires your direct intervention." Harding was still smirking, a picture of self-satisfied ignorance. Brenda, the flight attendant, had crossed her arms, looking impatient. She was starting to feel a tiny prickle of doubt, but she pushed it aside. "I'm on Flight 411 at JFK, Serafina explained. "There is a gentleman in my seat who has refused to move. He has made a series of racially derogatory comments towards me and has suggested that I belong near the lavatories. The flight attendant has taken his side and has just threatened to have me removed from the aircraft." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Then, she fixed her gaze directly on Harding, her expression unreadable. "His name? One moment." She turned to Harding, her politeness a weapon. "Sir, my father would like to know your name, for the record." Harding's smirk widened, though a flicker of uncertainty entered his eyes. "Tell your daddy my name is Arthur Harding, and I'm a senior vice president at Conwell Jacobs. And tell him to teach his daughter some respect for her elders." Serafina calmly repeated the name, and the company into the phone. She listened for another moment, and then the voice of her father, Alistair Vance, became audible, amplified slightly by the phone's powerful speaker. It was a voice that commanded attention, deep, resonant, and radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable power. What the nearby passengers heard sent a wave of shock and recognition through the cabin. "Mr. Arthur Harding," the voice from the phone said, each word a perfectly enunciated shard of Arctic ice. "I want you to listen to me very, very carefully. You have just made the single greatest miscalculation of your professional and personal life." Harding's face began a slow, horrifying transformation. The confident smirk melted away, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. There was something terrifyingly familiar and authoritative about that voice. "My daughter," the voice continued, "is Serafina Vance, and I am Alistair Vance, the founder and CEO of Vance Global Logistics." The name landed in the cabin like a 10-ton bomb. Alistair Vance. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a legend, a global icon whose face graced the covers of Forbes and The Economist. His company was a sprawling empire that touched nearly every aspect of modern commerce. His daughter wasn't just a girl. She was royalty in the world of global business. The color drained from Arthur Harding's face. He looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. He now understood, with sickening clarity, exactly who he had been tormenting. In a fit of petty racism, he had picked a fight with the daughter of one of the most powerful black men in the world, in a cabin full of witnesses with recording devices. Passengers were now openly gawking, many with their own phones out, Googling the names, their faces reflecting awe and shock. The young man who had been recording from the beginning now had a grin of pure vindication on his face. He knew he was sitting on viral dynamite. Brenda, the flight attendant, looked as if she had seen a ghost. Her knees seemed to buckle slightly as she realized she had just threatened the daughter of a man whose net worth could probably buy the entire airline she worked for and turn it into a parking lot. But Alistair Vance was not done. "Mr. Harding," his voice boomed, now carrying the full, crushing weight of his immense power. "You racially profiled my daughter. You verbally abused her. You created a hostile and discriminatory environment in violation of federal law and basic human decency. The next few moments of your life are going to be very unpleasant." Harding tried to speak, but only a strangled squeak came out. Mr. Vance, I had no idea. You were just what, Mr. Harding?" Alistair Vance's voice cut him off like a guillotine. "Being a racist? Assuming a black child couldn't possibly belong? Revealing the content of your character for the entire world to see?" Harding looked around wildly, his eyes pleading for help, for an escape, but he found none. Every face was a mirror reflecting his own ugliness back at him. The flight attendant tried a desperate act of damage control. "Mr. Vance, sir, this is the lead flight attendant. I can assure you this is all a terrible misunderstanding. I'm certain we can—" "There is no misunderstanding," Alistair Vance interrupted, his voice a low growl. "You sided with a bigot against a child. You failed in your primary duty to ensure the safety and dignity of your passengers. You threatened my daughter. Your career is over." Serafina stood calmly amidst the carnage, watching the two adults who had tried to humiliate her crumble under the weight of their own actions. Her father had taught her that power was not for revenge. It was for enforcing justice, for creating consequences so severe that they would serve as a deterrent to others. "Now," Alistair Vance's voice filled the cabin, radiating absolute command. "This is what is going to happen next. Make sure you are subscribed. I am telling you, you need to be here for what is about to happen. This billionaire is about to show the entire world what happens when you mess with his family. Do you believe people like this deserve to lose their jobs and face public humiliation? Let me know exactly what you think in the comments." The first-class cabin had fallen into a state of suspended animation. The only sound was the faint hum of the auxiliary power unit and the voice of Alistair Vance, a voice that was now methodically deconstructing the lives of two people. Every passenger was frozen, knowing they were privy to a rare and brutal display of power-meeting prejudice. "Mr. Harding," Alistair Vance said, his tone that of a surgeon about to make a precise incision. "You need to grasp the totality of your stupidity. You didn't just annoy a passenger. You chose to publicly harass the daughter of a man whose company, Vance Global Logistics, is currently negotiating a $200 million freight contract with your employer, Conwell Jacobs. Or rather, was negotiating." A low gasp rippled through the cabin. Arthur Harding's face, which had been pale, now turned a ghastly, ashen gray. He understood. This wasn't just about public shame. This was about the complete and total annihilation of his career. "Sir," Harding pleaded, his voice a pathetic, broken whisper. "Please, I apologize. From the bottom of my heart. I made a terrible mistake. If I had known who she was—" That is the most damning part of your apology, Mr. Harding. Alistair Vance's voice sliced back, cold and unforgiving. You are not sorry for being a racist. You are sorry you were a racist to the daughter of a powerful man. That reveals a bankruptcy of character so profound that it is beyond repair. You believe respect is conditional, something to be dispensed based on status, not humanity. That makes you not just a bigot, but a liability. The flight attendant, Brenda, made another desperate attempt to intervene. Mr. Vance, I can assure you that our airline takes these matters very seriously. We do not condone discrimination. Alistair Vance's laugh was a short, sharp, brutal sound. A misunderstanding? Let me be clear. My daughter presented a valid ticket. Mr. Harding presented nothing but belligerence and racial slurs. You, an employee of this airline, chose to threaten the party who was in the right. That is not a misunderstanding. That is complicity. That is a choice. Alistair Vance was no longer just a furious father. He was a CEO identifying a systemic failure, and he was about to correct it. I am putting you on speaker, he announced. I want everyone on this flight to bear witness to what accountability looks like. Serafina tapped her screen, and her father's voice erupted from the phone, filling the cabin with its immense, commanding presence. Captain, Alistair Vance said, and the passengers realized with a jolt that he was no longer addressing the people in the cabin. He was addressing the cockpit. This is Alistair Vance. I am on the phone with my daughter, Serafina Vance, in seat 3A. I need you to halt all pre-flight preparations and return this aircraft to the gate, immediately. A moment of stunned silence, and then the captain's voice, slightly distorted but clear, crackled through the plane's own intercom system. Mr. Vance, this is Captain Davies. We are third in line for takeoff, sir. Is there a security threat? Yes, Captain, there is, Alistair Vance replied. There is a passenger who has racially harassed a minor and created a hostile environment, and there is a crew member who has failed to follow protocol and has enabled this behavior. As per federal aviation regulations, both individuals represent a disturbance and a potential threat to cabin safety. I am formally requesting their removal from this aircraft before it proceeds. The declaration was a thunderclap. Passengers stared at each other, their expressions a mixture of awe, shock, and grim satisfaction. A flight on the verge of takeoff was being turned around. Not for a mechanical issue, not for a medical emergency, but because a 13-year-old girl had been the victim of racism, and her father had the power to literally stop air traffic. Harding made one last, desperate appeal. Mr. Vance, please, I'm begging you. My job, my family, don't do this. Do what, Mr. Harding? Alistair Vance's voice was utterly devoid of pity. Don't ensure that you can never again use a position of perceived authority to abuse a child? Don't make it clear to the world that this behavior has consequences. Don't protect my daughter? The captain's voice returned, now firm and decisive. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We are returning to the gate to resolve a passenger issue. We appreciate your patience. The low rumble of the engines changed pitch as the massive plane began a slow, deliberate turn, abandoning its place in the takeoff queue. Harding slumped back into the seat, Serafina's seat, a completely broken man. The reality of his self-inflicted ruin was crashing down upon him. His petty act of prejudice was now an international incident, being uploaded to the internet from dozens of phones. The airline executive, Brenda, attempted to whisper something, perhaps one final plea for her job. Quietly, Alistair Vance's voice cut her off, as if he could hear her thoughts. You want to handle this quietly? You think racism is something to be swept under the rug? That is precisely the problem. That is the corporate cowardice that allows this poison to fester. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with the weight of generations of struggle and the power of a self-made empire. Let me tell you all something. I did not build a $20 billion company from nothing so that my daughter would have to endure the same vile prejudice that my grandfather did. I did not shatter glass ceilings in every industry I entered so that my child would be told to know her place by some mediocre middle manager with an inflated sense of self-worth. The cabin was silent, every soul hanging on his words. "This is not just about Serafina," he continued, his voice resonating with moral authority. "This is for every person of color who has been made to feel small, for every child who has been underestimated, for every individual who has been judged not by their character, but by the biases of others. What you are witnessing today is a message. The days of consequence-free bigotry are over." Through the windows, the passengers could see the flashing lights of airport security vehicles converging on their gate. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and clearly initiated by someone with immense pull. "Mr. Harding," Alistair Vance said, his voice now taking on the finality of a verdict. "You chose to publicly humiliate a child based on her race. You assumed that a young black girl was powerless. And now you will be publicly removed from this aircraft, and you will face the full consequences of that assumption." Harding began to openly weep, not tears of remorse, but of pure, selfish despair. He was crying for his lost job, his ruined reputation, his shattered life. "Security is now boarding the aircraft," Alistair Vance announced calmly. "They will be removing Mr. Harding for violating federal law and airline policy. They will also be removing flight attendant Brenda Patterson for gross professional negligence and complicity in discrimination. After they are gone, Flight 411 will proceed to London. And my daughter will take her seat, and she will be treated with the respect that every single human being on this planet deserves." The heavy thud of boots on the jet bridge signaled the arrival of the authorities. Serafina Vance remained standing in the aisle, a calm and composed observer of the justice she had set in motion. She had learned a powerful lesson from her father. True power isn't about shouting. It's about having the influence to ensure that when you speak, the entire world is forced to listen. The racist and his enabler were about to learn that the person you underestimate can, in fact, bring your entire world crashing down. Don't you dare go anywhere. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because the walk of shame you're about to witness is going to be epic. Have you ever seen karma delivered so swiftly and decisively? Tell me what you think these two deserve in the comments below. The heavy door of the aircraft opened with a pneumatic hiss, and the cabin was suddenly filled with an overwhelming sense of authority. A team of officials boarded Flight 411, their movements crisp and purposeful. Leading the way were two uniformed Port Authority officers, their faces set in grim, no-nonsense expressions. They were followed by two FBI agents in sharp suits, whose very presence elevated the incident to a matter of federal concern. Bringing up the rear were two panicked-looking airline executives, their faces pale with the stress of managing a crisis of catastrophic proportions. The lead Port Authority officer, a man whose name tag read Captain Miller, surveyed the first-class cabin, his experienced eyes quickly identifying Arthur Harding, who was now a trembling, weeping mess in seat 3A. Behind Miller, the senior airline executive, a woman who introduced herself as the vice president of in-flight services, looked as if she were about to be physically ill. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Miller announced, his voice commanding immediate silence, "we are here to resolve a reported disturbance. We ask for your continued patience and cooperation." His gaze landed on Harding. "Mr. Arthur Harding," Miller said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "please collect your personal items. You will be deplaning with us." Harding made one last pitiful appeal, not to the officers, but to the cabin at large. "This is a misunderstanding," he sobbed. I was trying to keep the cabin orderly." She was confused. "Sir," one of the FBI agents interrupted, his voice like chipped granite. "We have at least a dozen passenger videos that have already been forwarded to our field office. The footage includes you using racial slurs, refusing to present your boarding pass, and harassing a minor. The time for misunderstandings is over." The agent held up a tablet, displaying a crystal-clear video recorded by the young man in the row behind. It showed Harding's face, contorted in an ugly sneer, as he uttered the words, "back in economy," near the toilets. The other agent added, "We are opening a federal investigation into potential civil rights violations under Title 49 of the U.S. Code, which prohibits discrimination by air carriers. Your voluntary cooperation is advised." The phrase "federal investigation" seemed to finally sever the last of Harding's delusional hopes. He was no longer just a man who had lost his job. He was a potential criminal defendant. The senior airline executive, Ms. Drake, then stepped forward, addressing the cabin but making direct eye contact with every recording phone. "On behalf of this airline," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I want to offer our deepest, most sincere apologies to Miss Vance. The behavior she was subjected to is antithetical to everything our company stands for. It is unacceptable, and it will not be tolerated." Harding, desperate and unraveling, made one final fatal error. "I'm a Platinum Medallion member," he shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "For 30 years, I deserve some loyalty. I was maintaining the standards of this cabin." His use of the word standards was the final nail in his coffin, an unwitting confession that his standard for first class was the exclusion of black children. A collective groan of disgust went through the cabin. "Mr. Harding," Captain Miller said with finality, "you can come with us voluntarily, or we can arrest you right here for interfering with a flight crew and causing a public disturbance. The choice is yours." Simultaneously, the other airline executive, a grim-faced man from Human Resources, approached Flight Attendant Brenda Patterson. "Ms. Patterson," he began, his voice low but audible to those nearby, "your actions today constituted a catastrophic failure of your professional duties. You failed to protect a passenger, you sided with an aggressor, and you threatened a victim." Brenda, her face ashen, began to stammer. I was just trying to de-escalate, to find a compromise." "There is no compromise with racism, Ms. Patterson," the HR executive said coldly. He held up his own tablet, which was displaying a live social media feed where the hashtag #WashWashHar racist on Flight 411 was already trending globally. "Your decision to enable Mr. Harding's behavior has been viewed by approximately 3 million people in the last 20 minutes. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending termination. Please surrender your crew ID." The most powerful moment, however, was still to come. As the officers began to escort a now limp Harding from his seat, Serafina's seat, Alistair Vance's voice came over the speaker one last time, a final poignant address to the captive audience. "Everyone on this plane," he said, his voice imbued with a deep, resonant authority. "Remember what you saw today. You saw prejudice in its rawest form. Mr. Harding saw a young black girl and assumed she was insignificant, that she was powerless. That was his fatal mistake. His bigotry blinded him to reality. Harding was now being led down the aisle, the walk of shame being recorded by a forest of smartphones. The man who felt so superior moments ago was now a disgraced spectacle, his humiliation complete and eternal. "This is the outcome," Alistair Vance continued, "when prejudice collides with power, when bigotry is met not with silence, but with consequences, when a system that too often protects the privileged is forced to serve justice. I did this for my daughter, but I also did it for every person who has ever been made to feel that they do not belong." The HR executive took Brenda's ID, and a second security officer gestured for her to follow him off the plane. As the two disgraced individuals were escorted off the jet bridge, a strange and wonderful thing happened. A single passenger began to clap. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted in a wave of spontaneous, sustained applause. They were clapping for the justice they had just witnessed. They were clapping for the poise and strength of the 13-year-old girl. And they were clapping for the powerful reminder that sometimes good does win. Serafina Vance finally walked to seat 3A and sank into the plush leather. It was her seat. It had always been her seat. She looked out the window, her composure finally giving way to a small, private smile. "Serafina," her father's voice came through the phone, now gentle and filled with paternal love. "Are you all right, my love?" "I'm fine, Daddy," she replied, her voice soft. "I just followed your rules." "You did more than that, Princess," he said, his pride evident even through the satellite connection. "You stood your ground with grace and dignity. You showed them all that a Vance never, ever backs down from a fight for what is right." The captain's voice returned, a new warmth and respect in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, the issue has been resolved. We are now cleared for departure. To our esteemed passenger in 3A, on behalf of the entire crew, please accept our profound apologies and have a safe and pleasant flight." As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, the passengers settled in, forever changed by what they had seen. They had witnessed a live-action parable about the poison of prejudice and the power of accountability. They had learned that the person you choose to belittle, the person you deem insignificant based on the color of their skin or their age, might just have the power to ground your flight, end your career, and teach you a lesson that the whole world will watch. The story of Flight 411 went globally viral, becoming a defining case study in corporate responsibility and civil rights. For Arthur Harding and Brenda Patterson, it was the end of their professional lives. But for Serafina Vance, it was a beginning. She became an unintentional icon, a symbol of quiet strength and the potent idea that true power is using your privilege not to elevate yourself, but to enforce respect and dignity for all. If this story of justice and empowerment moved you, please make sure you are subscribed for more incredible stories of resilience and triumph. We all have a role to play in standing up to injustice. What is one small thing you can commit to doing the next time you witness an act of prejudice? Share your commitment in the comments below. Let's start a conversation, not just about the problems we face, but about the solutions we can create together. Thank you for watching.